Welcome to the 2013 Public Service Activities and Extension Conference. There are a lot of new faces out there, and we hope to take this opportunity this week to get to know each other. My task this morning is to give you the conference overview. The conference registration will be manned this morning and pretty much throughout the day. And Heather and Meredith will be available to answer any questions during the conference. So is Heather or Meredith one in here? No, they're sitting at the desk, and so, all right, they're working. There is a hospitality suite available to you in the Martin Inn. I believe that is suite 430. And if you have any specific questions about the times when that is available, please see one of those ladies. The fabric Frisbees and cloth cleaners that you received at the registration desk are courtesy of the Clemson University Staff Senate. So we want to make sure to acknowledge them for their gift. Following this morning's general session, we will have lunch in the ballroom. Concurrent sessions will begin at 1:30. The choices for the concurrent sessions resulted from the RFP process and a mix of general professional development topics that are being offered based on comments from your training needs assessment. And these time slots were not intended to offer a session for each of your extension program areas. We get that a lot in terms of feedback on our surveys that we do for the conference, our evaluations from the conference. They'll say, well, my program area didn't have one. Well, it's not necessarily based on that. It really was for professional development. And you will have an additional choice of sessions at 2:20 and also at 3:25. We'll have a break in there. The mobile trailer is available. Some of you, as you were driving in, saw that. It's out in the parking lot here, kind of in the side parking lot. It will be on display. Celebrations for next year's Smith-Lever Centennial will present great opportunities to use the trailer. So we want to make sure to see Donna and all those folks that will be in that trailer. Think about all the expos, the fairs, and other large events in which Extension engages where you might use that trailer. Program team leaders and regional lead agents are wearing a special name tag to identify who they are. I wanted them to have that so our new agents would be able to identify you. During lunch today, we will have some tables reserved. It will be over to the right as if I'm facing you in the ballroom, it'll be over to the right. We'll have some tables reserved for the new agents. And I encourage all of you to come by and say hello, especially the regional lead agents, county coordinators, and program team leaders. Please stop by and say hello. A social will be held at the Kresge Clemson University Outdoor Lab located at 415 Charlie White Trail in Pendleton, beginning at 5 o'clock tonight. There should be some printed directions on the conference registration table. I know some of you are going to be carpooling. Wednesday is Program Team Interdisciplinary Sessions Day, and these sessions were coordinated by your program team leaders to include topics of related programming and disciplines for future collaborative opportunities. Team leaders, please allow a mid-morning break for your group. Then you'll begin at 6 o'clock in the ballroom for the banquet. And then we're going to hopefully have an opportunity. I'm not sure if that has been confirmed yet, Brian, with our new president, Dr. Clemens. Has that been confirmed? We're hoping that he's going to be here. Okay, good. All right, and then on Thursday, all program teams will have meetings. Our trainings beginning at 8 o'clock. Make sure to have your mid-morning break. You'll have lunch. Lunch will be brought into this auditorium, and you will be eating in here. Your program team leaders have coordinated a program team night out beginning after 5 o'clock, I believe, and the details will be shared with you in your program team meetings. On Friday, we will end the conference, but we will start at 8 o'clock that morning, and we will have general sessions throughout noon, and then you will return home. Lunch will be on your own. You'll be able to return home after that. A link will be provided to an electronic evaluation that will be sent to you, and we're encouraging you to complete that so we'll know how to improve for future conferences. Did I leave anything out, Dr. Callahan? Nope. All right. Okay, well, if you have questions after that, let us know. If there's no other announcements for this morning, we are truly excited about our speakers today, but I believe we're going to, before our speakers come, we're going to have Dr. George Askew to come up and give us some comments from public service activities, public service update. Thank you.
Della promised to save me at least 3 minutes to talk, so I'll put my New Jersey voice on and talk from my New Jersey side. Everybody that's been hired since January 1st, 2013, would you all stand up? So just stand up just a second. That's great. Thank you. That's a lot nicer than the 4 years when nobody stood up because people were leaving every year and we got smaller and smaller and smaller. So I think overall 2013 has been really, really good. I'm just going to go to some brief highlights. At least I believe they're the highlights. We spent the last year reinvesting funds that we had accumulated from people that left and we hadn't hired back. We followed the plan that on the extension, experiment station, regulatory, and livestock poultry health side that you all help have input on. And we did stay with the plan. The things we posted on the web that we were going to hire, we tried to stay with that. A few emergencies popped up here and we had to fill in, but generally we stayed with the suggestions that you all came up with. So you all saw the agents standing up. We have some specialists we've hired. The program assistant program, I think, is working well out in the state for counties that were really, really short. We're going to try and get all those counties covered at some point in time as the dollars allow. And we also started to reinvest our new funds. The legislature was very good to us last year. We got $7 million overall to redo the PD laboratories. We've hired Dr. Smith, who has to oversee all that work. Welcome, Dr. Smith. He gets to come in and rebuild a lab, start a new program, and write a strategic plan all at the same time. So surprised you're even here today, but glad you could make it. We also got $1 million in recurring money to hire plant breeding folks and other advanced plant technology scientists and staffing at PD, so that's excellent. We got $500,000 in recurring money for precision agriculture work at Edisto, and those hires are underway, and those are extension and experiment station hires both in those programs. It's not unique one to the other, so both programs are elevated quite a bit. And then some of you all, your team leader has been involved in this, but we started a program with Dr. Cole. Where's Steve? Back. Steve Cole and I worked up a program and handed it on to Brian and the extension folks to share some of the revenue they have coming in to actually work with the programs out here to make you guys more of an educational arm for regulatory and be another force out there for them to help our growers understand what regulatory is all about and maybe improve our compliance a little bit. So that was very good. Thank you, Steve, for working on that. We're going to have a lot of change next year. If you look from the top down, we have a new president that starts in January. When he comes on board, we have an interim vice president for research that he has to replace. We have an interim provost that has to be hired. We have an interim dean for the graduate school that has to be hired. I believe our undergraduate dean is retiring in August. We have several deans throughout the colleges that are out there, so a lot of changes. A new extension director search is underway. Some of you may be involved in that, and I believe as of this morning, Ted Whitwell told me we had 11 candidates, and the committee was being asked right now to go through with a matrix to evaluate them on probably 10 or 12 characteristics to see which group we wanted to interview. And looking through that, we have some excellent candidates there, so I'm hopeful that next year we'll have a new extension director on board, if not sooner. This current year, there's be some brochures that Steve Meadows will put out there in the lobby that tells you what we're trying to do this year with the legislature. We have 3 particular, very specific asks. The first is for agribusiness and emerging farmers, and there's a good description of that in there. I won't waste a lot of time doing that, but basically it's to hire what we used to call ag econ, kind of beefed up a little bit to agribusiness for forestry as well as the agricultural side of things, to put agents and specialists out in the state to support farmers that are here now, people that are trying to get into farming, do everything we used to do with enterprise budgets, commodity evaluation and so forth, as well as evaluating new technologies and new systems that are out there that they can put in place to improve the business side. So we're hopeful that'll come through. That's a $2 million, I believe, $2 million ask. That's correct. We also have another $1 million ask, or let me think, I'm gonna get this right here. Lose all my numbers. Brian wouldn't let me use slides this morning. I had to do that. So it's $2 million ask for precision agriculture, which is, and environmental technology, is to try and get all this new GPS technology, to get scientists to work on the sensors, get scientists to work on the information systems, to work on the mechanization part, as for the forestry, for the wildlife things, as well as agricultural crops. That's a $2 million ask. And we have a $5 million one-time ask, and that's to upgrade our equipment at all of our research education centers and on the farms up here. So we try and have at least the equipment we tell everybody else they ought to be using out in the state, rather than some of the older things. And if our research scientists and engineers are going to be able to adapt new technologies for the farmers, they need to have the same technologies on the farm. So that's our goal there. I think we have a lot of support out there for doing this. What we found out is legislature in the past are very good at focusing dollars on us for things that have an economic impact. So one of the goals, you probably hear me talk about it, you've heard your team leaders talk about it and beating it to death, is number one, get our advocacy program up and working. And Dr. Meadows and you all have been working really hard to have, I think, 18, 19 advocacy meetings around the state all together. I think they've been very successful. You all have been really good at getting the right people in there that can support our budget and understand us, and also carry our message back to everybody else in their region. So having that focus and that input is important both ways. Help us learn what people need, help them understand what we're trying to do, and then get that support to the legislature. So we're hopeful that we'll get some dollars out there from the legislature to support these new programs. The other thing we talk about all the time is just figuring out what all this means that we're doing here today. And you probably hear me talk about metrics and metrics and metrics, and you're probably tired of me hearing about it. But that's important, because when you go to the legislature these days, they talk about economic impact. They don't mind investing dollars, but it has a good return when they have the dollars to invest. And they're counting on us to come back and be able to show them what the return is and things that you can measure. A lot of times that's difficult. On the research side, it's a little easier to predict. We have standard quantifying things. We have results we can put out. Extension, sometimes it's different. You guys have programs. You put the information out. You teach people new systems. We don't know if they use them. If they use them, are they successful? So we're really counting on you all to help us figure out how to measure the impact of what we're doing out in the state, so we can make sure we're doing the right things. We can throw away the things that are wrong. We can also report back to the legislature. People give us the dollars on how their dollars been invested and what the return is. So that's Dr. Meadows' task. Now he travels around the state. He's supposed to figure out what we do county by county impact-wise across all of PSA. That's the Livestock Poultry Health Unit. If we got meat processing plants, if we have other health issues with animals we can deal with in a county, hold the regulatory services for people that are working with fertilizers, pesticides, and so forth, the impact of our research from the experiment station, and certainly the impact of the extension programs for getting that information back out to the people. County by county, you need to do that assessment. So individual counties, you're going to keep being asked to try and help us figure out what we're doing in your county, so we also know what we're not doing, so we can reinvest back in and make everything come back up to speed across all the counties. So that's my New Jersey rapid speak talk. I'm going to try and be here most of the conference. I'll be here through lunch today. I'll be here tomorrow in the afternoon. I'll be here all day Thursday. And if you need to talk to me about anything in particular, I'll try and be around. Just grab me and ask me to talk. So with that, I'll turn it over to Della. Thank you.
I was told to let you know that the first two concurrent session slots this afternoon will be when the mobile trailer will be available. So that will be one of your options as a part of your concurrent sessions. All right, we are ready now for our first speaker. We are pretty excited about this. We heard her, those of you all who attended the PLN meeting in Nashville earlier this year. We did hear her speak, and she is just an engaging speaker. Amy Lynch. She is a baby boomer. She has studied the generations for longer than she cares to admit, she says. She is president of Generational Edge, LLC, helping groups move beyond generational awareness to generational strategies. She is the author of How Can You Say That?, a book about parenting communication in the digital age, and the author of the forthcoming Can't Retire, Aspire, about baby boomers in the workplace. She has been quoted in the Washington Post, Investors Business Daily, USA Today, and the NBC Evening News, among others. Today, she will help us recognize the many ways that we can work together as different generations in the workplace, and she will give us more insight into the ways that we can work together more effectively. Let's give a warm Clemson welcome to Amy Lynch.
Hey, Della, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. You know, I do spend all my time studying the generations, kind of a generational geek. And so I shouldn't be surprised when something comes along that reminds me of the generational differences. But I have to tell you, I was taken by surprise just a couple of weeks ago because I was with my granddaughter in a restaurant. And they had this really cute thing they had, as we walked through, they had a phone booth, and hanging in the phone booth was a Superman costume. Right? So we stopped to look, and it was, you know, bright blue and red and yellow. It looked terrific. And my granddaughter says, AJ, what's that? She calls me AJ, rather than grandmother, you understand it. She said, AJ, what's that? So I'm all over this, right? This is one of those grandmotherly moments. I can pass on my values, you know, truth and justice and Superman, and I'm ready to talk about that. And I start talking about Superman. She says, no, AJ, what's that? Yeah, you got it. I said, honey, that's a phone booth. Of course, she's wondering why on the earth you would take your cell phone into that little tiny room, so we had to talk about that. But you know, what that reminded me of was how much change has happened just during my lifetime. Because, of course, as a kid, I knew about phone booths, used phone booths. She had no idea what it was. All that rapid change makes us very, very different as generations. And that's the background for what we'll be talking about today, because we're going to talk about how we work together as different generations of agents, and it's that change that is driving all that. Now, when Della invited me to speak, I did not realize I was coming to the cradle of extension. I'm kind of overwhelmed. But you know, Clemson was one of those first extension stations that was used as a model across the country, and of course our hero, Frank Lever, from here, that whole act that made extension possible. By 1914, you had this group of guys. Where's Danny Howard? He gave me this photo. Danny, thank you. These were... Oh, man, I set you up for that one. I'm sorry. Yeah. You had these guys going all over the state, and by 1930, you had agents in every single county in the state. So it's so exciting to be here where all this started. It's so exciting that I think we should celebrate. We should celebrate the 100 years of your service to this state. And here's what I'd like for us to do. What I'm going to do is tell the story of extension, and you guys are going to help me. Ready? All right. As I tell the story, each time I say silent generation or silence, you're going to say, I pledge allegiance. I pledge allegiance. Great. And when I say baby boomers, we'll say, peace man. What about Gen Xers? What should we say for Gen Xers? Whatever. Yeah, good. Laugh out loud. Now, what I had was, don't have a cow. Does that work? All right. And for millennials, what should we say for millennials? Those people in their 20s and early 30s. Word would be a good one. Awesome is what I had. Does that work? Awesome. I'm sorry, did you have something? Oh, good. All right. So if you would, stand up. And we are going to do an amazing thing. We're going to tell the history and celebrate the history of extension in about 2 minutes flat, or a minute and a half, maybe even. Ready? Once upon a time, there was a land, and in that land, the people were of the silent generation. They were good people and fortunate, because in that land, the Smith-Lever Act provided for extension programs and extension agents. Now, when I say extension agents, we will say our heroes. But in time, the silent generation were troubled by a Great Depression and by boll weevils in their cotton. And they did not have enough money, and sometimes they did not have enough to eat. So the extension agents went to the silent generation and taught them how to grow more food, how to conserve food, how to do a great many good things such as diversify crops. And the silent generation were greatly comforted. In time, the baby boomers joined the silent generation in that land. And the baby boomers were finding new ways to live, and they were more mobile. And the extension agents went out to the baby boomers to teach them and their children to live fully with their, do it with me, their heads, their hearts, their hands, and their health. And the baby boomers found all this cool. Okay, a little faster now. And in time, the Generation Xers came to live in that land with the boomers and the silent generation. Now, the Gen Xers were often of the city. So the extension agents went to them in the cities and in the rural areas, and they helped them with after-school programs, computer skills, home gardens, entrepreneurial skills, and all things needed for living well. And the Gen Xers were totally down with that. In time, the millennials joined the silent generation, the baby boomers, the Gen Xers in that land. Now, the millennials had iPods and cell phones, and they did not know where their food came from, for they were of the city. And then the extension agents went unto the millennials and taught them science and citizenship and business skills and robotics and geospatial mapping and also the care of livestock, personal finance, energy conservation, the production of food, and the care of children, and all good things needed for living full and productive lives. And it was good. Thank you. Bravo. Thank you, guys. I grew up in rural communities in East Tennessee, and I do remember, and I was a 4-H member. I don't want to intimidate anybody, but I did win a red ribbon for my cornbread in 5th grade, and I tried to find it actually for this presentation. It's in a box at my mom's, and I know it's still there. And so I know your work to some degree through the years, and I do appreciate you so much. But I learned so much more about what you do, not just in farming, but in all the various areas, which is incredibly impressive. Now, let's look at these generations. How many of you came in today knowing what generation you are? Yeah, we tend to know. We don't always know what to do about that, how to use that information, and that's one thing that we're going to look at today. Let's see who's in the room. Do we have any silents in the room born before 1946? Yay! All right. Yes. I am so glad you acknowledged, and let us acknowledge your contribution. How long have you been with Extension? 40 years. Incredible. That's fantastic. Thank you. You know, I'm really glad you spoke up, because not long ago I was talking at a bank, and these two silent generation, they were older than you. They were like in their 80s. They came in, and I knew they were silent generation because I had been introduced to them beforehand. They were the grandparents of one of the people in the audience. So we said hello. They came in, they sat right down front, you know, where I couldn't miss them. So I came to that part, and I said, do we have any silents in the audience? They didn't say anything. They just kind of sat there impassively like the queen, you know, all is well. So afterwards I said, so I said to the granddaughter, why didn't they speak up and let us acknowledge them? She said, oh, they couldn't hear you. Then she said, but they loved your speech. Okay, do we have baby boomers in the audience? Ooh, we got a bunch of baby boomers. A surplus of baby boomers, I would say, even as a baby boomer. You're pretty quiet. You didn't cheer for yourselves. Gen Xers in the audience. Oh my gosh, we got a bunch of Gen Xers. You're quiet too. You didn't cheer for yourselves, right? And millennials, where are those millennials? Yes, look at this. I'm sorry, how many do we have? Hands up. Awesome. Yeah. Now, when I was working with Della beforehand, and she sent me the numbers of agents in the room and in the group, the numbers look something like this in South Carolina. They look something like this. Now, when you look at this, and you look at this, who's missing, obviously? The silence, there are many silents still working with us. And of course, the Gen Edgers, they're too young for us to hire. They're the kids right now. We could use their technical expertise, but it's not legal to hire them yet. What other number doesn't look quite right? Millennials, obviously. You guys have been through a terrible time of not being able to hire, and it's so exciting. What's going to happen in the next few years? How's this graph going to change? But some of the boomers are going to retire. Not all of us, though. You notice a lot of us have to stay. Yeah, we're working longer. How many boomers in the room are working longer than you thought you might? Yeah, we are. You know, and you know, we're healthier longer. We also had this terrible economy, and you know, it's hard to retire. Nobody knows what to call this long period when we're working longer. You know, this extra 7 to 10 years on average across the country that boomers are working. We don't even have a name for that. It's not the evening of our lives. It's not even twilight. I think it's happy hour. And we're staying for extra drinks. That's So we're still here, but yes, some boomers are going to be retiring over time. Gen Xers will be here, and what's going to happen to this number? Yeah, it's going to pop up pretty quickly because, I'm sorry? No, go ahead.
If any of them go to a land grant school and get the proper training,
That may go up. Well, let's hope that goes up because we need them. Because obviously your constituents run the whole range of all the 5, 6 generations that are out there right now. Okay, so that's going to be changing. And that's one reason that the committee asked me to talk about how we work with each other. Because we've got different generations with really different expectations of work and communication trying to work together. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let me give you a chance to kind of claim your generation and soak into it just a little bit. There's a handout in front of you that has some columns on it. And on the columns, they're labeled by generation. Look at those columns and circle 2 or 3 things in your column that help shape you and make you who you are today. Just take a couple of minutes and do that. Good, that's what my clock says up front. Not just things you remember, but things that help shape you in some way. I'm sorry? The Grateful Dead. And all that went with the Grateful Dead. You can remember that? When you've circled a couple of things, take just a minute and share it with the person next to you, somebody next to you, and just tell them what it was that shaped you or that made a profound impression on you as you were growing up. love this exercise. I love this exercise because what always happens is this. People can talk about it for a long time. Because the things that happen during those formative years, during our adolescent and teenage years, really profoundly shape what we expect when we come to work, what we expect when we try to communicate with other people. I urge you to take this back with you and use it with your team, use it with people you're working with or committees you're on or whatever, because it can help you just talk about where you came from and what you expect from each other. It can help build understanding. Let's do a little debrief. What things came up that were interesting or maybe something you didn't expect to come up or something you heard from somebody else that was interesting? The Three Stooges shaped our sense of humor for the times. Yeah. Yeah, our sense of humor is different with each generation. Green Yeah. And why did you circle Green Acres? Seriously. It wasn't on there. That's right. There are spaces for other at the bottom, which we can always add. Who else came up with something that was interesting or really did have a profound effect? All in the Family. Man, that allowed us to talk about issues that we hadn't talked about before. It was powerful. You know, sometimes when I work in Europe or in Canada, they'll circle that too. That show had such a profound effect. Made it okay for us to talk about stuff. Yeah, and to laugh about it. What else was circled that might have been of interest? Gen Xers, the Gen Xer who circled something? Yeah. Challenger explosion. Yeah, seeing it firsthand right there. Boomers, how many of you remember where you were the night that the guys landed on the moon? Yeah. And Gen Xers, how many of you remember the Challenger explosion? Sure. Look at the difference in those two things. Man on the moon, we're thinking, man, we can do anything, right? Challenger explosion, wait a minute, what went wrong? So that when I say NASA to baby boomers, it's a very positive experience. When I say NASA to Gen Xers, no. I saw those heads shaking. No, it's not a positive word. Yeah. Very different experiences as different generations. What else came up? Anybody put working moms? Sure. What else came up from millennials? What did you guys circle? 9/11, of course. Affected all of us. You were 40 miles away? Whoa. Were you scared? School got shut down. I remember when my daughter was in school and they'd have those lockdowns. We didn't have those when I was in school. It was a different experience in terms of security for your generation. I'm told by people who work in companies that often one of the questions millennials ask when they come in to interview is, what are your emergency plans? Right? What happens if somebody brings in a gun and starts shooting? Well, that was not a question I would have asked my first employer. Different experience, yeah. Other millennials, what else did you circle? You got to speak up because there aren't many of you. Next time you might all want to sit together so you can take care of each other. World Wide Web, of course, affected the way you think, affected the amount of information you expect to have. Okay, all these things, powerful things that shape us, and that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to explore these and talk about how that shaped us and how, as a result, we have to meet each other halfway when we're going to work together and communicate. Let me say this. When it comes to working together, every single generation has experienced, misunderstanding is the word I use, when you come into the workplace. Boomers came in, somebody might have thought we were long-haired hippies, right? Yeah. And we kind of were. It was the times. What about Gen Xers? You came in, you got called what? Come on, there was a nickname Gen Xers had. I don't know what that one was. That one may not be repeatable in the back there. What was the name that Gen Xers got unfairly? Lazy. Slackers. Slackers. Yeah, because you were working on computers. You knew what to do with computers, and the silent generation, baby boomers didn't, we didn't look at that as work. Got called slackers. Baby boomers, I want you to help me with this. It's probably time to do this. And we got a lot of boomers, got a lot of Gen Xers in the room. Boomers, raise your right hand. Look into the eyes of a Gen Xer near you. And boomers, repeat after me. I'm sorry if I ever called you a slacker. Confession is good for us, moves us along. Okay, every single generation has experienced misunderstanding because every single generation comes in and they work differently. As a matter of fact, in a national survey, let me tell you about this. As a matter of fact, this was in Fortune magazine about the new generation coming in, saying that they want to dictate terms to their employers. They demand productive tasks from day one, no make work at all, and they want to be noticed for every single thing they do. Which generation was that about? All of them. In this case, it happened to be about the boomers. 1969 was when that was published. Yeah, but it sounds like what people say about millennials today as they're coming into the workplace. Each generation experiences that, and once we get there, it's not easy to work together. In a national survey, 65% of the people of all generations said sometimes generational differences make it hard to get my work done. 65%. Now, what does that mean to you? It probably means that there's a better than a 50-50 chance that you're driving somebody of another generation crazy. Just by being yourself. You don't even have to try, right? It's better than a 50-50 chance somebody of another generation is driving you crazy sometimes. So we gotta understand what we expect of each other. We gotta understand how to work together if we're gonna do this good work of extension together. And also another point, I just want you to remember, you're not alone with this misunderstanding. It's everywhere. It's in every industry, it's in every state, it's everywhere. So you're not alone when you come up against those bumps and those hard places, when working with another generation. But you guys, I have faith in you. You're all about communication. You're master communicators, right? No question about that. Danny and I were talking about that. You communicate all the time with people in your county, your state, across the region. You're masterful. Today, we get to turn a mirror on ourselves and look at how we communicate internally with each other. It's a little different. To do that, we're going to look at every single generation. From silence on, we're going to look at each generation, talk about how they communicate, how they work, and that way we'll get some tips. That way you'll carry away some to-dos and some tips. Sound good? Questions? Let's start with the silent generation. What do we know about the silent generation? What should we know about the silent generation? Everything. Good answer. They're the most experienced, they're the ones that carry the most wisdom, right? But seriously, what characteristics would you give to the silent generation? Courage. They built what this country is today. They were builders. That is a name that is often given this generation, builders. And courage to do the job. No question about it. This is a group that's patriotic and that's loyal, that's fiscally conservative because they grew up in the wake of a great crisis after the Second World War and also with memories of the Great Depression or with the effects of the Great Depression. So yes, they are a group of builders who knew how to overcome adversity. And you know how they did it? They worked together in organizations. This is really important. This is a group that believed in the power of the organization, that believed in the power of what happened when people worked together. So they believed in the county government, they believed in extension, they believed in school and in church and in the Lions Club, all those organizations that hold people together. The Silents had great faith in those organizations. This time when the Silents were growing up, about 75% of the population of South Carolina was rural. And so there was a lot of work for extension agents to do in this area. Now, this group believed so much in organizations, they relied so heavily on organizations that being called a regular Joe was a compliment. It was a compliment. Because it meant you fit in. It meant you supported that organization. Being called a regular Joe. Now, you don't call me a regular Joe today. I'll call HR, try to figure out what you mean. I don't know. The Silents were such builders that, in fact, Neil Howe, who's one of the fathers of generational theory, called them almost pathologically positive, right? Can-do-it group, so can do it. And one way that they got it done was because there were rules and regs. These people knew exactly when and where to wear those hats. And I remember that from when I was a kid, right? There were times when ladies wore hats and times when ladies did not wear hats. There were places you wore hats, places you didn't wear hats, places you wore your white gloves, places you didn't wear them. There were rules and regs. There was a right way to do things. And at work, these two people knew exactly whose name went on the memo first. Whose name went first? I'm sorry? Oh, his, I'm afraid that's true, yeah. Yeah, okay, his went on the memo first, but also the person with the highest title went first. There were rules and regs about how to do things. And that was just part of the way that the silent generation thought. And it worked. It worked. They built the greatest industrial infrastructure that the world had seen, so it absolutely worked. Now, during this period, let's talk about what Extension was doing. What was Extension doing during the 30s and 40s and into the 50s? Let's talk about the 30s and 40s. What was Extension doing here in South Carolina? Home demonstration, all those things, from sewing to canning to gardening to poultry, all the things that people needed to survive and to be more productive. What else was Extension doing?
Helping feed America.
Totally. Helping feed America. You know, these victory gardens, which of course Extension agents fostered with tools and help and know-how and seeds, there were 250,000 of those victory gardens in South Carolina alone. 250,000. In 1943, 40% of the veggies in this country were produced this way. So Extension was helping people survive and helping them, of course, with that essential thing, the boll weevils, the crop rotation, all that stuff, helping people produce enough food that America could be fed. Okay, when we have a time like this, when there are clearly rules and regs in place, and by rules and regulations, I mean just a right way to do things, there's an expected way of doing things, then in generational theory, we think of this as a period sometimes called a high and sometimes called a period of belonging. When working with the organization is critical and highly important. Now, the way that we communicate during a period like this is usually top down. Military command and control, and it works. As a baby boomer, when I first went into the workplace, that was still what I expected. I wasn't a member of the silent generation, but I knew that's how things worked. I knew that when the boss said to me, jump, I said, you can do better than that. He said jump, and I said, you got it. How high, sir? Yes. Now, millennials, if I say jump to you, what do you say? Yeah, why? So why are we jumping? Or I got a whole new way of jumping. You're going to love it. Yeah. Yeah, how about a virtual jump? Oh, that's a great response. I'll jump virtually, just excuse me. Actually, I said that to a group one time, and this guy, I said, hey, you know, when you say jump to a millennial, what do you hear? And this guy in the back, I don't know if he was a millennial, he said, screw you! Then I was in North Carolina, and I said it to a group, and this very polite young woman right on the front row, she said, no, thank you very much. So it's a difference between, you know, cultural differences. But it's the same message. The same message. Wait a minute, let me think about this. Why are we jumping? Because millennials expect to have a voice, unlike the silent generation and unlike the baby boomers when we first went into the workplace. So let's sum up about the kind of communication that we inherited as a legacy in Extension and in all areas of our lives. Whether you're talking about church or community or just all these different ways we inherited this kind of communication. You have a chart on your handout, which I'll urge you to use today because we'll be looking at each of the generations and it'll sort of help you sum up where we go today. For the silence, when it came to information, no news is good news, right? If I'm not hearing anything bad about the company, if I'm not hearing anything bad about the county or about Extension, then everything's probably okay because I don't expect to have the information. Change, we did it the right way. Okay? The silence had a way of doing it, and it worked. It worked. Communication tended to be top down, and the work ethic of silence tended to be you work to live. Sure, you work, And why? You work to live. You work to feed the country. You work to feed your family. Make sense? Sound true when you think about the silence in your life, the silence that you know? I always think about my grandmother and her farm when I think about the silence, of course. And after World War II, the thing I remember about her is a wonderful memory. After World War II, she got a surplus Jeep. And she drove that Jeep all over those rocky East Tennessee hills as she herded her cattle and did it. She drove it until she was in her 80s. It was really remarkable. I can't keep from thinking about her anytime I think about the silence. How many of you had parents and grandparents who were silents and who were on the farm? Yeah. Okay, and leadership tends to be autocratic for this group. Now, anytime we have a period of belonging, when institutions are really strong, just historically, it just happens again and again every 100 years. Then we have another period that is an awakening, when the institutions get challenged. Now, if you were a part of the last awakening, you're going to remember this. Whoa. Scary, huh? You millennials, I didn't mean to frighten you with that if you hadn't seen that before. You couldn't change the channel then. Why? It wasn't, they all went off. How many channels were there? 3. I heard somebody say 4. You were in the city. Yeah. During this period, in fact, our communication was more limited, and it was one way. It came to us through the TV like that. The baby boomers, as I said, grew up in a period of awakening, a period when things began to move quickly. And I always think of this period as boom, boom, boom. A boom in births. The population popped up. We've got 4 million births a year for about 20 years. You know, those silents came home from fighting World War II. The economy was good. There were jobs. Companies were growing. It's a good time to have kids. So they looked at each other and they said, let's have babies, right? Oh, there's nervous laughter when I say that. You did know, right? Oh, okay. So anyway, the baby boomers were a huge population that were born 1940s all the way up into the mid-1960s. The boom in population happened, and then the boom happened in the economy as well. It was growing. And then the other boom that happened was in social consciousness during this time. Very different from that period of belonging. Now, one thing that made it different was that baby boomers went to school in vast numbers. 80% of all the baby boomers graduated from high school. That was huge. 30% had some exposure to college. That was huge. So when baby boomers came together on those campuses, they created a youth culture. They looked back out of that bubble and said to the silence, you know, no more of this regular Joe stuff. I'm an individual. In fact, it became quite popular to be kind of restless, you know, even if you don't have a cause. I love this. And they both came from such good families. Yeah. But it was a time when a generation, it was a time of awakening, a generation looked and said, you know, things are going to change. Those organizations you've been loving, we're going to challenge them. That's what happened in the big scheme of things. As a matter of fact, I'm a boomer, we were so enamored with youth and with changing everything that, of course, we said, right. Now what do we say? Yeah, under 30. Don't trust anyone under 30. Now we say age is just yeah, you're as young as you. Yeah, we changed our tune a little bit as time went on. But during that period of awakening, of course, that period had its own soundtrack, as does every period. Had its own sense of humor. And it was a time of movement, a time when we tried to create change. Yeah. The anti-war movement, the women's movement, and of course the civil rights movement. It was so profound for boomers growing up because we saw incredible acts of everyday courage, and we saw huge events of terrible disappointment. anytime you've got a period of awakening, it is a fabulous and frightening time. Full of possibility. People are trying to bring about change. Full of possibility and full of peril at the same time. Now, somebody mentioned these guys. They were the perfect epitome of this, of the silence and the boomers, duking it out over all that social change that was going on. And they did. They were a profound effect. They allowed us to talk about a lot of things we hadn't talked about before. Everything from breast cancer to racial issues to everything. And we were allowed to laugh at Archie's bigotry. It was really important in the era that we could talk about that. Now, at the same time that all that social foment was happening, riots and assassinations and sometimes burning cities and all the things, all the protests, everything that happened, while that was happening, there was the second boom, and that was the boom in the economy. See S&P for 20 years. It's basically going up. Yeah. Wow, this is when we were told and when we thought, we began to believe that the stock market would return 7% year after year over time. Remember that? I know. It was when we thought that houses would always go up in value. Remember that? But we learned it, we baby boomers learned it from an economy that just kept going up while we were growing up. Companies kept growing. The economy kept growing. And there were, by and large, a fair number of jobs in the country. So there was an optimism that came with being a baby boomer. Social change, growing economy, and then the other thing, of course, we mentioned this, man on the moon, science. It seemed like we could do anything. So as a group, boomers, we became pretty idealistic and hopeful. Boomers, is that label okay with you? Can you accept that one? Yeah, actually when we survey boomers today, we still find them pretty hopeful. Kind of, yeah, we can get that done kind of people. There's another side of boomers I want to mention that has to do with how many of us there were. I said we were born every 8 seconds for 20 years there was a baby born, and so, people, it was crowded. It was a crowded place. By the time we got to school, we swamped the school system. Boomers, how many of you remember classrooms that were sort of like this? They were swamped. They were full. Not too many. You must have had big classrooms in South Carolina. But a lot of us went to school. I remember not having enough desks in the room for all of us in elementary school, not having enough books in the room for all of us. I sort of thought that was normal. I thought school was just crowded.
We had a lot of people lay out.
Yeah, because there wasn't any room, or yeah. Well, and there were so many of us that, there was no time to take attendance. You didn't know if they were out or not. So it was very crowded, and by the time we got to the workplace, there weren't enough jobs for boomers. When I got my first job, I was a teacher. I knew that I better hold on to that job, because if I screwed up, there were 79,999,000 other boomers out there. I held on to that job hard. It was hard to find a job as a teacher during those days. So we boomers became rather competitive. So many of us, we had to figure out how to stand out in the crowd. We became competitive. We did two things. We learned to use face-to-face personal skills really well. Have you noticed that? Baby boomers are really good at reading body language. You see an extension agent who's a baby boomer sitting on the tailgate talking to somebody. They're not just talking information. They're reading that person's mood. They're reading that person's body language. We became really good at personal skills. You notice the boomers in your offices are the ones that are probably the best at listening carefully to the people and hearing not just the info about the crops or the poultry or the forest, but the other stuff that's going on in their lives. We became really good at that. It's a way we got things done. I know baby boomers who can pick up the phone and hear your voice, hear 3 words, and they can tell not just what kind of mood you're in, but what you had for breakfast. That's how good we are. And boomers, we do often walk away from a meeting with an impression, with an impulse of understanding the people who were there, because we use those social skills. We also we use those social skills, we got really good at meetings. We love meetings. Sometimes we want to meet, just to meet. Haven't seen you in a while, let's meet. But meetings were how we got things done. We didn't have computers, we didn't have emails. Meetings were how we got things done. And so sometimes if you're a Gen Xer and you're thinking, oh, do we have to meet? Can't we just do it by email? then you may need to step out to that boomer and say, you know, can we meet at this point, or how about we meet at that point, because maybe we don't have to meet yet. And maybe we boomers need to step out and make sure meetings are quick and efficient. I've noticed this difference, is if you ask me to a meeting and I'm a boomer, how do I feel? Oh, you need my expertise. Yes, very important. I'm so glad you invited me. I'll be there. But if I'm a Gen Xer, how am I likely to react? Oh, God. Yeah, I heard that. Can't I sit at my desk and multitask? I'll just listen in. I mean, whatever. But do we have to meet? Completely different reaction. And then in the meeting, the boomer's really interested in process, right? We can talk it to death. We can talk and talk and talk, and we want to make sure everybody gets heard. It's real important. And the Gen Xers sometimes are saying, just decide already. Let's go. So when we meet, got to meet each other halfway. Make the meetings efficient, make sure people are heard, but move them on, because we're all very busy these days, and the pace of life has accelerated. Make sense? Okay. And sometimes we boomers have to ask, do we really need to meet? And really work with our understanding of why and where we meet. The other thing we boomers learned to do was to work. That's the other way we were competitive. How many boomers learned to read with Dick and Jane? Sure. And the 13th word we learned was work. Right after See Spot Run, we learned the word work. And if you look at those books, you look back, they're really interesting because the grown-ups never play. They only work. We learned that lesson well. We tended to put in the long hours so that it was a competitive world, so that we could stand out and get the job done, so that we could keep our jobs. We worked long hours. We invented the 100-hour work week. That was a gift. Yeah, thank you so much. You don't have to thank us, that's all right. Yeah. And so time, our perception of time and work can be a real issue between the generations, because we were socialized to work in order to compete, to work in order to survive. In fact, we became so competitive that by the 1970s, hippies were becoming yuppies. There was no question about it. This book came out and sold 3.5 million copies in just a couple of months' time, because we had learned to compete in the workplace. Now, we were still idealistic. You know, I said that we were hopeful and idealistic. We were. It's just all that idealism and the big movements had been channeled into work. If we'd cause some change in the world, if we couldn't change the whole world, we'd cause what change we could in our work. So it got poured into our work. So the other word to put with this is competitive. Boomers, is that okay? You accept that? Any other words that ought to be up there to describe boomers? I'm sorry? Oh, well, old, yeah. Yeah, I know, I'm a boomer. We boomers know what you guys call us, you younger guys. Dinosaurs, yeah. Fossils, I've heard it, yeah. Granola. Granola. But you know what we call you, right? Young. No, seriously. There is that dynamic. I mean, I'm laughing about it, but there's that dynamic of people with experience and then people who are growing and learning and ready to lead in many cases. And when we come together, we have to respect each other and respect those differences. It's not easy, because we do work differently in so many ways. Okay, as baby boomers were growing up, what was Extension doing? What was going on with Extension? First of all, Extension was integrating. 1964, that happened in South Carolina. In 1969, Extension was meeting the needs with additional food and nutritional information for people that were poverty and near poverty. In other words, all those social causes, Extension was taking on. Extension was helping people step up to all those causes. By that time, about half the population here in South Carolina was rural. And so Extension was also moving toward more urban services. Now, what happens during a period of awakening when institutions are challenged, when new ideals come up? The communication does change. And so let's think about baby boomers. How did we learn to communicate? Help me fill in the blanks. If silence thought no news is good news, baby boomers thought no news is no news. Just didn't know. Like to know, don't know. If silence thought we did it the right way, what did boomers think? I did it my way. Yeah, more individualistic. Communication for silence was top down. Communication for boomers, anybody got a word? Circular, it can be. Yes, a lot of process. A lot of process. And a lot of processes put in place that we boomers respected, and it would sometimes be circular. A word I used for circular was cautious. You know, make sure everything's documented, because we're competitive. And also, as we talked about, face-to-face. How about work ethic? If it wasn't work to live, it was, live to work. Yeah, work is a life mission, or live to work. Now, when I say something like this, I am vastly overgeneralizing. I'm just trying to give you images to work with as you meet people halfway. I'm not saying every boomer lived to work. I'm just saying that as a group, that's the way that we were socialized. And leadership, visionary. We wanted leaders who were visionary. Let me give you some tips then. Danny Howard and I were talking about one of the issues around, you're not the only one I quoted, Danny. You don't have to be embarrassed. Okay, I'm going to embarrass some other people later. Okay, we were talking about some of this that comes up is around technology, right? Because we boomers did not grow up with technology. We value that face-to-face time. And so one thing, as I think about our groups and we work together, let me give you some tips on that, on tips on working together. We boomers must learn to delegate more. It's easy for us to think, well, I've always done this, I've done it right, I've got all the info, and sometimes we don't delegate enough to those Gen Xers. Gen Xers, how long have you been working? How many years? How many? 20, 25, some Gen Xers. 15, so you know a lot, you're ready for leadership in a lot of situations, and we boomers can find it hard to delegate, to hand that on to that next generation. So boomers, do me a favor, clear your throats. We're just going to say delegate, okay? You ready? Delegate. Let's try it again. Delegate. Yeah, it's real important to do that. You didn't do really well, so you might have to practice in the mirror in the morning before you go to work. But it's really, really important for us to delegate. And we, as boomers, must be willing to question the way things have always been done. We need to measure results. Not just, it's important that we have face-to-face, but we need to measure results. We need to recognize work that people do remotely. It's really important. We need to ask, do we need to meet, and make the meetings efficient. And encourage chameleons. When I say chameleons, I mean people who dress for the occasion or for the audience. If I'm going to go meet with some Gen Xers, then I want to dress like the Gen Xers dress. I want to behave like the Gen Xers behave. And if I'm going to meet with boomers, I want to dress, dress a little more because that's what boomers do. And I can almost, in this audience, I can almost pick out the boomers because we're dressed a little more, formally. It's just what we expect. It's the way that we grew up. But chameleons are people who know how to dress for the audience they're going to be addressing. Encourage that as boomers, so that we look at people who may dress less formally, because millennials and Gen Xers grew up less formally, and we say, oh, that's okay, that's who they're talking to today. That's who they're dealing with. Okay, also, if we're going to deal with boomers, be chameleons, recognize the experience, we said that. Boomers are very competitive. We need to be recognized, as do all generations. But we boomers are kind of needy. We are. We love plaques. Yeah. Yeah, we do. I mean, I'm half kidding, and I'm half not. We do need to be recognized and not forgotten as we get older. Not forgotten that we bring that experience. Okay, use face-to-face time with boomers when it's important. Face-to-face. And talk about vision. Boomers are, we grew up during a time of passion and visionary leadership and movements, and so if you talk to us about vision and your passion, we can relate to you more easily. Okay. A period of awakening is always followed by another period, a period that we call unraveling. And that's when institutions tend to start to erode and start to fail a little bit. Now, if you were part of the great last unraveling period in this country, you're going to remember this. It goes on forever. It took us forever to get online, but we were so excited when we did. Remember? It was really big. Okay, growing up as a Gen Xer. Growing up as a Gen Xer was very different from growing up as a boomer, obviously. For one thing, well, the rural population in South Carolina was falling. It dropped to about 45% while this group was growing up and hung there, stayed there. And we can think about Gen Xers as a bust, like we were thinking about the boomers as a boom, as a bust in population, fewer people born, a bust in the economy, very unpredictable economy, a bust in social idealism. So all three things were happening. One big thing that was really important, in 1980, CNN was founded. And that meant for 24 hours, we had news. Gen Xers grew up seeing everything. No more 1 hour news in the afternoon or 30 minutes in the afternoon even, but yeah, can you believe that? The news used to be on for an hour a day. Can you believe Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America, a news anchor? Can you imagine a news anchor being the most trusted person in America today? Things have changed a lot, and changed during this Gen X period. When you've got 24-hour news, then you've got hungry news outlets who are going to tell the whole story. The curtain's pulled back, and so everything is seen. And all those organizations come into question. For instance, Gen Xers saw the Enron scandal from the beginning to the end. They saw the WorldCom scandal from the beginning to the end. Gen Xers, of course, we mentioned the Challenger and all the questions about those O-rings. It was all there in front of us. Gen Xers were less protected from the harsh realities of life. And when it came to politics, we knew the whole darn story if you were an Xer, right? Knew the whole story. As a matter of fact, Gen Xers were old enough to hear one president say, "I am not a," and then to hear another president say, "I did not have." Yeah. Yeah. So Gen Xers naturally grew up knowing a lot more, just with a lot more information than boomers had grown up with. And I mentioned the bust in the economy. During the 1970s, a barrel of crude oil went from $3 to $40, and the economy took a hit. How many of you remember lining up to buy gas and it wasn't there? Yeah. This is when Gen Xers were growing up and were most impressionable. And one of the first impressions they had about farmers were farm aid. Farms were in trouble, right? That's one of the first things Gen Xers saw about farmers. And of course, during the time they were growing up, there was the farm crisis. It was hard to turn on the television without seeing tractors on the streets of Washington, without seeing foreclosures, without seeing all the outcome of this terrible time when farm prices went down and farm debt went up. I'm sorry? We need to go back. What do you mean? It's time to go again? Yeah, in many ways. Yeah. I think there's a lot of wisdom in this room of people who remember what legislation means and doesn't mean when it happens. Yeah. Something that might be a good sharing point, a good talking point between the generations in the room. So Gen Xers grow up in a very uncertain economy. As a matter of fact, they're seeing downs. If they're living in the cities, if they're living in the country, they know about this. If they're living in the cities, they know about downsizing, right-sizing, people letting go, a lot of layoffs. So that when Gen Xers grow up, boomers heard, "You'll do better than your parents." Xers heard, "You won't do as well as your parents did." That made Gen Xers very pragmatic. Some people say skeptical, cynical. I like the word pragmatic. Realistic. You guys are realistic. You want to know, will it work? What are the questions we need to ask? That makes sense? I work with a Gen Xer named Kel, and one day I drove into work and I saw these signs on the interstate, and they said, 15 minutes to this exit or 10 minutes to that exit. And I went, oh, that's fantastic. That helps me plan. That kind of calms me down about the traffic. So I went in to Kel and I said, Kel, aren't those signs great? And he said, yeah, if you believe the signs. Gen Xers, always asking the hard question. And sometimes if you're a boomer, you want to leap across the table and go, just believe in something. And sometimes if you're a Gen Xer, you want to say, will you please, you boomers, will you get realistic, right? We have to meet each other halfway. Gen Xers believing in the dreams of boomers, and boomers understanding that those hard questions need to be asked. So pragmatic. Xers in the room, how many of you will accept that label? You got it? You want skeptical instead? No? You're going to take pragmatic? I like pragmatic. It's realistic and it's positive. It's a positive word. If you believe in what? If you believe in voting? One thing that sometimes when I'm talking about how pragmatic Xers are, somebody will say, some pragmatic or skeptical Xer will go, oh, you can't, I don't think so. And so I did find a study that shows that Xers are so pragmatic and realistic that they believe this. Yeah. And another thing that comes to mind when I think about Gen Xers is during the time you were growing up, this ad became immensely popular. And it kind of became the watchword, and I think it really suits Gen X.
It certainly is a big bun. It's a very big bun. Big fluffy bun. It's a very big fluffy bun.
Where's the beef?
Some hamburger places give you a lot less beef on a lot of bun.
Where's the beef?
At Wendy's, we serve a hamburger we modestly call a single. And Wendy's single has more beef than the Whopper or Big Mac. At Wendy's, you get more beef.
Where's the beef? That was the Gen Xer watchword, and the watchword for the era. One way you can deal with things when institutions are crumbling, which is the period of history when Gen Xers grew up, is with humor. And so Gen Xers have their own brand of humor. Have you noticed that's ironic? It's not PC. It's kind of twisted sometimes, but it's a great sense of humor for dealing with times like this. The Far Side became popular when Gen Xers were growing up. Nobody was off limits. They made fun of everybody. And the pace of change was accelerating. This book came out while Gen Xers were growing up, and it was the first time people had talked about too much information in too little time and how it leaves us kind of future shocked. Everything was accelerating. The speed at which people thought was accelerating. This book sold 6 million copies in no time because we were beginning to see the acceleration of things. Gen Xers, you grew up learning to read where? Sesame Street, right. Forget Dick and Jane, you got Sesame Street. And what happens on Sesame Street? There's a 10-second cartoon, there's a 1-minute skit, there's a 1-minute reading lesson, bump, bump, bump. So your brains learn to think how? Quickly, to data quickly, and you're also on the internet by this time. So you learn to process quickly, you learn to think in short bursts, and MTV then, as your teenagers, validates that. Again, it's short, quick bursts. But you weren't just learning to think quickly, you were also learning to think for yourselves. 40% of the Gen Xers in the country were latchkey kids. And 50% of the Gen Xers in the country came from the children of divorce. Divorce tripled while Gen Xers were growing up. So that meant you went home and you put the Hot Pocket in the microwave for yourself, right? Did your homework on your own, managed your own time. Became very able to think for yourselves and to do for yourselves. Xers, sound valid? Yeah? Yeah? You remember, how many of you were latchkey kids at you were in charge of your time at least some of the time? Yeah. Raise your siblings, sure. It was an era when you needed to be, in order to survive, you needed to be really independent. By the time this movie came out, everybody, it was like we were ready to laugh about latchkey, but yeah, there was a reason this movie was popular. So I want to add a word to pragmatic, and I want to add the word independent. Got it? Does that work? You accept that? I notice the Gen Xers I work with, they're like this. They're like, this is Gen Xer. You tell me what you want, when you want it, where you want it, how you want it. Now, I'm going to go away. Hopefully, you're going to go away. I'll get my work done. Xers are famous for wanting to work alone independently and for getting more done independently and for feeling really comfortable working independently and not wanting to be micromanaged. Sound valid? Yeah, okay. Another place where we have to meet halfway. No, no generation wants to be micromanaged. Of course not. Thank you for micromanaging my speech as we go. You guys are great. Okay, Gen Xers, let me just give you a couple of other interesting things that happened. You guys made old Clint Eastwood movies famous because he was so independent. You know, he comes in off the desert, does the job himself, and then leaves. Independent. There was this big bump in these old spaghetti westerns. Demographers thought, why? And then they began to look at Gen Xers and went, oh, got it. They were on the rebound. Again, remember Nike? How many people were in these ads? 1. And they were very popular for Gen Xers. Now, what happened for Gen Xers as latchkey kids was not that they turned away from family, the opposite. Gen Xers turned toward family, created families among friends. But what was this show all about? It was all about marriage. Should we marry? Will we marry? Who should I marry? Wait, I was drunk. Are we married? You know, do you remember this? And it was all about babies. It was all about, is she pregnant? Is she happy she's pregnant? No, she's not. Oh, yes, she is. I mean, you know, it was all of this stuff about commitment. Gen Xers are married actually in bigger numbers than boomers today, and their marriages seem to be lasting, no question about it. And time became so important, family time. This group that grew up as latchkey kids did not turn away from family, turned very heavily toward family. 76% of the people who are Gen Xers who have preschoolers at home read to them more than 3 hours every week. And 80% of the Gen Xers who have junior high kids at home help them with their homework nearly every day. This is a group committed to family so that time and control over your time becomes the new money. It becomes the new success for this generation. So what did Extension do when this generation was growing up? Who remembers what was happening during the 80s? During the 70s? After school care became really important. 4-H had an initiative so that after school care was, because people worked, we got 2 families, 2 parents working, and so after school care became really important. Other things with that economy shrinking, then master gardeners and gardening became really important. This group was, and also all the stuff in the urban areas, because now more than half of South Carolina lived in something like towns or cities, and so that programming changed in response. During a period of unraveling, let's fill in the blanks for the Gen Xers. No news is good news, no news is no news. No news is bad news, I want to know. I grew up having information, I grew up on the internet. Change, I did it my way, let's try. Does that way still work? Communication, direct, ironic, efficient. Work ethic, work-life balance. We boomers wouldn't have thought of that. You guys, thanks for that. You brought it to work. And now we need it too. We're trying to figure that out. And leadership, empowering, not micromanaging, but giving somebody the power to do the work on their own. So as we worked together, I had a fascinating conversation with a group of people on the hall. Barbara Brown said younger people have this internal guide about work. When they work hard, but they know when to quit. They've got an internal guide about family. And she was talking about her son. She was talking about a lot of Gen Xers. Is Barbara? Yeah, thank you. And then Anne added this. That is a discipline that helps us do our work well. And then Dave, are you here, Dave? Dave was saying, yeah, we all knew that when we first started work. But the years of work can take that away from us, and we have to get the reset button in order to find that balance again. This is a task for every generation, to get enough of the work done, but to know when to say enough, and to take care of ourselves and our need for family. Make sense? These are hard conversations to have sometimes, but they're conversations we have to have. One thing Gen Xers can do is choose. When am I going to question and push back, and when am I going to jump? Remember that jump, how high? Times to jump, times to question and push back. Another thing Gen Xers can do is talk to boomers about evolution, changing things but not revolution. Not saying what you did was no good, we're going to change everything around here, but just talk about moving things along more gently. Doing the necessary face-to-face time. Documenting your work when you work remotely so that boomers can appreciate the work you did even if you weren't face-to-face. Make sure everybody's heard, because as a Gen Xer, you may have a tendency to like run and get it done and do it on your own without making sure that everybody, including the new guys, the millennials, have a voice. And filter your feedback with nice. Why would I say that about Gen Xers, huh? Because you're direct. You're so direct. I was working with this one Gen Xer, and I made a presentation one time, and as I left the room, you know, she goes, you know, that was pretty good. However, I would change it this way, that way. I mean, I'd do this, and I don't know. So I think you ought to change. And then she ended. She said, that was really good. I'm glad you did that. I was so confused. If you're a Gen Xer, you may know that you're direct. That may be what you want in terms of feedback, but it may not be what the millennials on one side or the boomers on the other want. They may want you to make nice. You know that sandwich thing where you say the nice thing first? Bad news in the middle, nice thing again. Do that with boomers and millennials, you Xers. It will make your life easier. Now, we're going to see through that when you do it. We made it up. But it still works. It still works with the other groups. So do filter a little bit with nice. And we're all from the South. You know how to do that. Okay. A period of unraveling is followed inevitably by a period of crisis. You'll remember this if you grew up during a period of crisis.
You've got mail.
Millennials grew up, the population in South Carolina had hung about 40-45% while millennials were growing up. But again, millennials did not have the connection to the farm that the earlier generations had. I remember I was with my kids up in the mountains, East Tennessee mountains, and we were picking blueberries. And a group of Boy Scouts came by. They were millennials, okay? They came by, this is in the 1990s, and they they attacked those blueberry bushes. They were all over them, you know, snarfing down. And one of them said to another one, "These taste just like blueberries." Disconnected from where the food came from. So millennials are a very different, high-tech generation. That same guy could have found anything on Google, right? But didn't know the blueberry bush when he saw it. Okay, very high-tech, so high-tech that right about the time they were born, Time magazine named the person of the year a computer. Not a person, but the computer. 3 years later, just as the first first millennials, were entering kindergarten, IBM released this. Anybody have a Commodore? Remember, you could play Pong on it. It was pretty cool. Guess how much storage it had? 178K. That's about the size of one tweet on Twitter today. I'm not kidding, it really is. So by the time, this was kindergarten, by the time millennials graduate from college, of course, they got this. And it will download ringtones alone that are 10 times the size of the whole storage of that IBM Commodore. That's how rapidly things changed in terms while millennials were growing up. In fact, what happened for millennials was that this shaped this. By the time the average boomer was 18, I had read for 20,000 hours. But by the time the average millennial was 18, they'd been on the cell phone 10,000 hours, gotten 200,000 emails and texts, been online for 10,000 hours. This is your brain on the internet. What happened for the millennials is a fabulous thing. But it's something we have to learn to work with. What happened for me was I learned to think while I was reading, and my brain works more or less like this, linear. R-E-A-D-I, reading, right? But my daughters who are millennials, as they grew up, they learned online, and their brains work more like this. Now, what does this do to people? This is interactive, give and take, text, emails, give and take. When they would go online to a site, they could not only learn things, they could say things. So they became very collaborative, expecting to have a voice and bring a voice to the process. And this is what they bring now and will bring as they come in greater numbers as extension agents. I see some heads nodding. Comments about this? When millennials were growing up, a couple of things made them collaborative. One thing was the technology, and the other thing was the parenting. Let me show you how collaborative they were. The Army, who has more money to market than anybody, appealed to boomers by saying, hey, you competitive boomers, be all you can be. But when they were talking to you Gen Xers, what did they say? Army of one, you independent son of a guns. And then they said to millennials, Army strong, you're part of something. Let's be collaborative. Army strong. See how different that is? Millennials come in wanting to be collaborative, to give and take, and to have a voice. One thing that caused that was technology. We touched on that. The other thing was parenting. Why are they called boomerangs? Coming home to live, right. For a whole bunch of really good reasons, like the economy. Yeah. Also in England called kippers, Kippers, kids in parents' pockets eroding retirement savings. But seriously, that tie, that give and take between parent and millennial kid is powerful. It's going to affect your work more and more. Gen Xers, you who want to work alone, you've got to make room for that millennial voice to be a part of projects. Boomers, it's maybe a little easier for you because you may have parented millennials, but you know they're going to come in and want to have a voice. Let me give you an example. Working in the real estate area. Realtors tell me that's often, who makes those frontline clicks, they call them, on the MLS site to find a house? Who is it? Young people. Yeah. Teenagers. Mom and dad, they're busy. Mom's going to the grocery store. She says, yeah, look, you know the neighborhoods, you know the school districts, you know the number of bedrooms. See what you can find. She leaves. Over dinner that night, what happens? Houses put on the table. That's how the family decides where to go visit. Vacations, same thing. Mom and dad are busy. Dad says, I really want to be on the water, and your mom likes to play golf, and see what you can find. The millennial finds the options. They decide over dinner. Dad says, here's the credit card. There's your vacation. Boom, booked. Okay. People in the hospitality industry tell me this is how it's done. So the millennial comes to you saying, I want to have a voice. I want to be collaborative. This is such a challenge. It sounds like a little thing, but it's a huge shift in where we'll be going in the next few years as you accommodate these millennials into your ranks and as you move forward. So when they look for leadership, when they look to you, if you've been here a while, they're looking for collaborative leadership, for somebody who gives them a voice. Not that they get to decide everything, but that they have a voice when they come in. I'll tell you one quick story and then I'm done. I was talking not long ago to a group of accountants, and there was this guy sitting in the back, and he was real tall, and he was sitting there like this. He didn't laugh at any of my jokes. It made me very uncomfortable. And I got more uncomfortable at the end because he came straight down that aisle, right at me, and I noticed people got out of his way. So, you know that Jim Croce song, guy with built like a refrigerator with a head? This is this guy. He comes straight up to me, he says, now you're telling me that I need to let these young kids come in and do things the way they want to do them, not the way I taught them. Busted. I said, well, tell me about it. And he said, and he tells me about a millennial who's using the software in a different way, found some shortcuts in the software, and just went ahead and did it that way. So I asked the guy, I said, well, did this new way work? Yeah. Then I asked him, was it faster? Yeah. Then I asked him a $1,000 question. I said, well, does this young guy know that if he comes to you with these new ideas, you're going to give him a voice. You're going to talk about those new ideas with the group and give him a chance. Guy goes, not yet. Now, here's the reason I love that guy. I'll never forget him, because he gave me language. We live in a not yet world. We're all working together. All of us from 20 to 70, we're all working together for the first time in history. But we live in a not yet world. We have not yet figured out all the ways to communicate and make that work smoothly. And I so appreciate the time with you this morning to talk about that. You're terrific. Thank you so much.
Token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
So much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Presents. Thank you. Woo! Is there a blue ribbon for cornbread in here? Is there a blue ribbon?
We'll get you one.
All right,
Where's
thanks.
Pam? Dr. Dern? We'll get you one. There she is. Thank you so much. We really are motivated and inspired by the message today, and you presented a great challenge to us. And so I can say on behalf of this group, I believe that we will accept this challenge. All right, we're ready. Let's see if we can, Dr. Lyons, will you come up and we can go ahead and make this transition with the mic? And while he's coming, I'll go ahead and introduce him. Good. Now, how do you do this now?
Dr. Lyons may know how to do that. That's Dr. Lyons. It's one touch somewhere, but I don't know.
Did he show you how to get
to
that,
start
how to
your
get yours
presentation?
up? He did,
Oh,
okay,
good.
all right. Thank you so much, we thank you. Okay, let's move on with our next speaker. We are pleased to have with us next is Dr. L. Washington Lyons. He is the Executive Administrator for the Association of Extension Administrators, AEA, usually is what you hear. He represents all of the historically Black 1890 land-grant universities, but he is located at North Carolina's A&T State University. Prior to assuming the role as Executive Administrator in 2005, Dr. Lyons was Dean of the School of Agriculture and Extension Administrator at Virginia State University for 12 years. He has over 35 years of service in the land-grant system, where he has served in positions at the county, district, state, and regional levels. Dr. Lyons has served in leadership roles in numerous organizations, including AEA, Extension Committee on Organization and Policy, we say ECOP, and Board on Agriculture Assembly of Association of Public Land Grant Universities, APLU. More recently, he was the co-chair of the Create 21 Committee that was responsible for developing new legislation for the 2008 Farm Bill for the land grant system. And he has received many awards and recognitions from his peers and stakeholders during his career. He earned both his BS and MS degrees from North Carolina A&T State University, and his doctorate from Virginia Tech. Dr. Lyons, we invited him to talk to us about the Cooperative Extension's 100 years and extending knowledge, changing lives, to set the context for our 2014 celebration of the Smith-Lever Act. Dr. Lyons, let's welcome him.
My screen doesn't come up.
Okay, let me see.
Okay. Well, good morning. While I get connected, based on the last presentation, I'm one of the older baby boomers, if you will. However, I will try not to bore you with a lot of my baby boomers talk this morning, but it's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to be with you this morning. I want to thank you for the invitation. It's been quite a while since I've had the opportunity to participate in an extension conference. I remember my days at the extension conference when I was in Virginia, and I'm not sure if the individuals who participated in our conference were as excited as you are this morning. Most of the time, individuals really, when you're talking about extension conferences, they really did not get that excited. What I'm going to do, I'm going to talk with you this morning about the legislative perspective of extension. Hopefully they're getting someone to get me connected. I can't pull the screen up. I don't want to go through all of the extension programs that are being conducted because that would just bore you. But what I want to do is kind of set the stage from which we have come in extension, what we have seen transpire in extension over time. So I'm going to try to walk you through the extension historical process to look at extension in the early years and then kind of culminate with how do we sustain extension. And this presentation is not going to be very exciting to you if I don't get my PowerPoint slides. You know, I haven't been a former extension agent. I can know how to improvise, but I really want to show you what I'm talking about. Well, let me say this to you. I often like to tell jokes before I do a presentation. And I work with a bunch of administrators. And the administrators often tell me, say, yo, telling a joke is a joke. So I was planning not to tell you a joke this morning, but while I'm waiting for the individuals to come to get me online, I often tell them practice make perfect. So I got an audience, I'm going to practice telling a joke this morning. And it's kind of appropriate, too. There was a cat and mouse. Cat and mouse, they both died. They both went to heaven. They were running around in heaven, and they ran into St. Peter. And so St. Peter saw the mouse first. He looked at the mouse and said to the mouse, said, how you doing this morning? Mouse said, I'm doing very well. He said, but heaven is so big. I need a little help to get around heaven. So the St. Peter put the mouse on a pair of skates. Mouse goes skating through heaven, enjoying himself. So a few days later, St. Peter sees the cat, and he says to the cat, how you doing, Mr. Cat? Mr. Cat said, heaven is the best thing ever happened to me. He said, why you say that? He said, I found a new meal on wheels. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my joke for today. And hopefully my skills are getting better. But what I indicated to you, I want to talk about the 100 years from a legislative perspective, how we develop, including the 1890s, the 1994s, and the 1862 land grant universities. Oftentimes when we think about the land grant system and extension, the first thing we think about is the MAR Act. And I'd like to make this a little interactive, if you will. The MAR Act was first introduced in which year? Pick one of the years on the screen. 1862. Any other takers? '55. It was actually introduced in 1857. MAR Act was introduced in 1857, and it was passed in 1857. However, it was vetoed in 1857. And so it was vetoed by President Buchanan at that time. And so the actual MAR Act was actually passed 5 years later, even though it was introduced in 1857. It was passed in 1862. During the time that the MAR Act was passed, we were living in a segregated society. Most of our institutions were private institutions. And so this was an opportunity to have public institutions so that the masses could attend these institutions, and there was a need for these institutions at the time. So because we were living in a segregated society, these institutions were not open to all people. Everyone could not attend these institutions, particularly people of color or blacks, if you will, at that point in time. So in 1890, the MAR Act was passed. Now, a lot of people often think that the second MAR Act, the 1890 MAR Act, was passed to introduce the 1890 or to create the 1890 land-grant universities. But this was not the case. The second MAR Act was actually passed to expand the funding for the 1862 land-grant universities, was to give those universities more funding. But in order for those institutions to receive that funding, they had to open those institutions up to all people. And this created a lot of debate back during that period of time. And there was a lot of resistance to doing this. So what happened was, in 1890, in order to pass this act and to provide the additional funding, in certain states, they decided to create a set of institutions that were known as the 1890 land-grant universities, and these institutions were supposed to be separate but equal institutions. So the act was not passed to create the 1890s. The 1890s were created as a result of the second land-grant universities. Now, I know all of you know this, so this is just kind of a repeat for you. We have how many 1890 land-grant universities? 17, 15, any other takers? 13, let's keep going, we get there. Okay, all right, let's hold that. And they're located in how many states? All of them. Okay, anyone else? Okay, all of them. And they're located in how many regions? How many? Speak up, come on, I'm not, hey, they're located in the South. I heard something else. Okay? Answer to your questions. There are 1890 land-grant universities if you count Tuskegee. Often you hear 17 1890 land-grant university, including Tuskegee University. They are located in 17 states. There are 3 states that have 3 land-grant universities, if you count Tuskegee, and that would be Alabama. They're located in 3 regions. The majority of them are located in the southern region. There are 14 in the southern region, 3 in the northeast, and 1 in the north central regions. Now, for the baby boomers in here, you would know the answer to this. The land-grant system is commonly referred to as the blank-legged stool. 3-legged stool. And the rationale behind that is because federal, state, local. No, it's because of the tripartite mission of research, extension, and teaching. We have the teaching of agriculture, home economics, and related subjects at our institutions. But there was a lack of research knowledge available. There was no new knowledge being generated at that point in time. And so this led to the creation of the Hatch Act in 1887. And all of the changes that took place in the land-grant system were tied back to the original act, the 1862 Land-Grant Act. And so the experiment stations also were tied to the land-grant institutions. And at that time, the Hatch Act created experiment stations at the 1862 Land-Grant University in order to create more knowledge to support teaching, as well as to solve some of the problems that were impacting agriculture at that point in time. But there was one fallacy, and that fallacy was once that research was created and developed, it was not being deployed, it was not being shared, it was not being taken to the people who could utilize it, and that led rise to the Smith-Lever Act. And the Smith-Lever Act provided funding for cooperative extension. Now, I'm going back in just a minute to show you that there was a lot of work going on for extension prior to the Smith-Lever Act, but the Smith-Lever Act was passed in 1914, and you guys know this history because Senator Smith from Georgia was one of the persons who introduced it, as well as Representative Lever from South Carolina, and the act was actually signed by President Woodrow Wilson, May 8th, 1914. This was the first act that we've been able to document that required the state to match federal funding on an equal basis. If you look back at acts that were passed to support agriculture, at that point in time, you did not see a lot of those acts that required matching funds. But in this case, there was a requirement for that to occur. So one of the provisions of that act indicated that there must be useful and practical, thank you, information. You guys could talk, you couldn't hear right there. I mean, I thought I was just coming out loud and clear. But the act was designed to provide useful and practical information. And I just lifted this actually from the act. If you would, and I'm not going to read it to you, but there are a couple of terms that you need to be aware of. Useful and practical information, not just to disseminate information, not just to put it out there, but to encourage the application of the same. You want individuals to use the information. When we talk about the impacts of our program, you can't determine the impact of the program if the people did not use the information. So back in 1914, they knew that this was important. I must also tell you, if you read the history, they had plans of work in 1914. So if you think it's difficult to develop a plan of work now, I can imagine it was very difficult for those to develop plans of work back in 1914. And the other note I want to make here, it says, extension work shall consist of the development of practical applications of research information. So in 1914, research-based. And this is what makes us different in extension from other organizations and other groups, because our programs are research-based. You go on the internet, you go on Wiki, you can find anything you want, but is it research-based? Is it something that you really need to use? So extension stands out because of the research-based information that we provide. I'm not going back and talk about Homemakers Club, Boys Club, Tomatoes Club, garden clubs. I just want to say to you from a programmatic standpoint, because I'm going to keep focusing on the legislative aspect of this. These are our 4 major program areas. We were doing work in these areas back in 1914, but we were addressing the problems of the time, and that's what we have to continue to do. We have to look at the problems, identify the issues, and develop programs that relate or address those issues. As we look at the pioneers, I'm backing up just a little bit. These 2 individuals, Seaman A. Knapp, Booker T. Washington, were very instrumental in helping to shape extension. Knapp is known as the father of the demonstration method. Did a lot of work back in 1903 in Texas with the boll weevil. Booker T. Washington was instrumental in ensuring that Tuskegee University would be involved in agriculture. He convinced Knapp to come to Tuskegee to look at the movable school that he had suggested to Booker T. Washington, that he suggested to George Washington Carver, that should be developed. That movable school was known as the Jessup wagon. It got its name from the banker in New York who contributed the money to make that wagon. And George Washington Carver actually constructed that wagon with his students at Tuskegee University. And it was used to demonstrate the latest farming practices, also to take information to families and community as it related to homemaking as well as youth work. And the movable school basically was the cornerstone for the extension program at Tuskegee. If you haven't seen the Jessup wagon, that's the Jessup wagon. That's the first one that was built, pulled by horses at that point in time. They graduated from the horse pull to an automobile truck, and that truck had exhibits in it. It had fertilizer, it had tools, because they went out to conduct demonstrations. The problem with the boll weevil and Seaman Knapp, The information was there, the research was there, but the farmers did not use it. So NAP went in and demonstrated how you can rotate, what type of fertilizers you needed to be using, and that's what made such a difference. Now I'd like to show you the modern day Jessup wagon. I heard someone talk about the mobile unit that you have, Clemson University. I show you this because this was one of the last projects that I developed while I was at Virginia State University. It is a mobile classroom. It has 12 computer stations. The computer stations have laptops, so you can convert it into a classroom. It has a satellite dish on the top so that you can connect independently to the satellite. You could take it anywhere. It could be used not only for agriculture, it could be used for youth work, family work, any type of program that you wanted. You didn't have to worry about whether you had electricity in a remote area because it had a generator. You didn't have to worry about connecting to the internet because you have a satellite. So even though the Jessup wagon was back in its day, this today continues to be a form of technology that we can use to take programs to communities. 100 years since the passage of the Smith-Lever Act. How many years would we celebrate since the allocation of federal funds to support extension at the 1890 land grants? Because when the act was signed, the Smith-Lever Act, we were in a segregated society. And so the Smith-Lever Act did not cover funding for the 1890 land grants to do extension work. So how many years, if we look at the celebration of the Smith-Lever Act being 100 years, how many years would it have been next year since the 1890s received federal funds similar to Smith-Lever funds to conduct extension work? How many? 58? Any others? Basically, 42 years. It was 1972 when appropriated funding was made available for the 1890s to become a full partner with the 1862 land grant to deliver extension to the people of the states where there were 1890 land grants. Prior to 1972, and most of you probably would not know that, maybe a few baby boomers would know this, and if you're an avid reader of history, you would be aware of this. But prior to 1972, most of the extension work was done by the 1862 university, except for some of the private institutions. The 1890s initially were not all public, or the funding did not go to public institutions. For instance, in Virginia, it was Hampton University, and then Hampton University decided that they no longer wanted to be involved in the extension and agriculture program, so the program was moved to Virginia State University. But initially, there were extension agents at Hampton University, a private institution, that actually conducted extension work in the state of Virginia. So during this segregated period of time that we're talking about, the Smith-Lever funding was not available at the 1890 institution, but the 1862 institution actually employed African Americans or blacks, as the history would say, Negro agents to work with blacks, and those agents were funded through Smith-Lever monies, and they were located at the 1890 institutions, but they were not 1890 employees per se, because they were appointed by the directors who had access or control over the Smith-Lever funding. And this was done to ensure that everyone had access to extension programming. And because we were a segregated society, then the Negro extension agents were hired to do that. And this continued until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which made segregation illegal. And this is what gave rise to Congress passing the law to provide funding for the 1890 land grants in 1972. Because the 1890s and the 1862 institutions had worked closely together, even though the 1890s did not have access to the Smith-Lever funding. In 1972, when Congress actually passed the act to provide funding, or it was in the Farm Bill really, for the 1890s, the dollars actually came to the 1862 land grant to be managed and to be distributed based on a joint memorandum of understanding between the 1890s, the 1862, and the United States Department of Agriculture. And that continued until 1977, when the 1977 Farm Bill was passed, and it stipulated that the funds would go directly to the 1890s. And this created the partnership between the 1890s and the 1862 land-grant universities to develop a joint extension program. I think I'm on the right track because I saw the baby boomer nod his head a few minutes ago. The mission of 1890 extension, when the law was passed, it was passed to expand extension. It was not passed for the 1890s to work with a minority clientele. It was passed in order to expand the participation in extension. Those individuals who were hard to reach, left behind, the social disadvantage, limited resource farmers, those were the clients that the 1890s focused on. But those were not the clients that their programs were limited to, because no program, you cannot discriminate. Programs have to be open to all people, but the emphasis was on those individuals. We know we have three types of funding: federal, state, and local. As we continue with this history, state funding for the 1890s were received in which year? I heard somebody. Come on, speak up. 72. Anyone else? It was not until 1998. So when Congress passed the Farm Bill to provide funding for the 1890s, they did not stipulate the same at that time as they did in the Smith-Lever, that they had to be state matching dollars. They did not do that until the 1998 Farm Bill. And when they did that in 1998, basically they did it with a phased-in process. So in 1998, they said the 1890s had to match at 50%. One rationale for that was they didn't want to put a hardship on the states in order to come up with the 100% match. So they went a phase-in at 50%, and that phase-in basically went to 2001. So by 2001, all of the 1890s had to have a 50% match. And then in 2002, in the 2002 Farm Bill, they indicated that the match had to be 100% by 2007. So now all land grants, except for one set of land grants, have to provide matching funds. And which set of land grants do not have to provide matching funds at this point? Anyone know? Territories. Thank you. And I'll talk a little more about that in just a moment. There we are. The 1994 institutions do not have to provide a match. The 1994 Tribal Land Grant Colleges Act created the 1994 institutions. These institutions have the same mission as the 1890s and 1862s to conduct research, extension, and teaching programs. There are only 32 tribal land grant colleges, and they primarily serve the Native American community. Briefly, the 2008 Farm Bill, which was known as the Food Conservation and Energy Act, or 208, had significant impacts on the land grant system. One of the major impacts probably was the creation of NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. The verdict is still out of whether that was a good decision or not, but be that as it may, we do have a National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the intent was to raise the level of research and extension so that extension and research would be looked at as a science, the same as they do in NIF and other science agencies. And so for the first time, the director of NIFA is a political appointee. The NIFA director is appointed by the president, but is not confirmed by Congress. It's a 6-year appointment. Prior to this, all of the directors for research and extension at the national level were basically federal employees. That act also created AFRI, the Agriculture Food Research Initiative, which is a competitive grant program authorized at $700,000 and funded somewhere in the neighborhood of $261 million at this point in time. And it provided additional eligibilities for the 1890s. And I won't say too much about that, except that one of the eligibilities was participation in FNEP. The 1890s were not eligible to participate in FNEP to any degree until the passage of the 2008 Farm Bill. I want to get you out of here before lunch. I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to expedite this just a little bit. This is something interesting. As you know, Congress is working on the Farm Bill as I speak. There are some who say that the Farm Bill will be completed or the majority of work will be done by Friday before they leave for the Christmas recess. There are others who say that that's not going to happen. But if it doesn't happen, the current Farm Bill basically ends at the end of this year. So we don't know what is going to happen. But what I want to call to your attention, there is an amendment in this Farm Bill, proposed Farm Bill, that stipulates that the Second MAR Act should be expanded, that they should enhance the funding for the Second MAR Act and make other institutions eligible to participate. Well, what it means is that since 1890s or 1862, other than the 1994 land grants, we have not had any more land grants to come upon the scene. This particular amendment was introduced by Congressman Turner from the state of Ohio, and it states that others should have this opportunity. One institution that has basically petitioned Congress to become an 1890 land grant is Central State University, out of which state? Ohio. Oh yeah, you know it has to be Ohio. I mean, there's no other state that would be as generous to an institution. But what the danger in this is, our review of Central State University, and I know some of you have your iPads and your computers out. If you would Google Central State University, they have no capabilities to deliver extension research or programs of teaching in agriculture. But yet, they have been approved by their state or recommended by their state to become an 1890 land grant. Why is this so important? It's important because every institution that becomes a land grant participates in the funding of the land grant universities. We talk about not having enough funding now. If we start bringing on other institutions, this becomes a real problem. Well, some say, well, this is an 1890 problem. This is a system problem because there are programs that the 1890 participate in that are also shared with the 1862. One of the biggest programs will be FNEP. So can we afford to bring on other institutions at this point to participate in such? So we don't know where this is going, but as we talk about the 100 years, maybe this is something that we may be dealing with as we move forward in the next 100 years. We talk about being the best kept secret. I don't think we're the best kept secret. I think there are a lot of people who know what we are doing and want to become a part of our system. So that's my editorial for today. I'm going to bring this to closure because I heard a few minutes ago that you need to document your outcomes, your impact. The land grant system, research, extension, and teaching at the federal level, and the majority of these dollars flow down to the land grant institutions, is a $1.14 billion enterprise. Ladies and gentlemen, when we think about what goes into this system from the federal level, $1.14 billion. Now, we're not taking into consideration at this point the state match. And the state match for some institutions could be 3-to-1, 2-to-1, 4-to-1. I don't know. I didn't try to do that particular math. But when you add that up, bring in your county funding, We're talking about a major funded enterprise here. On the federal level, just for extension alone, I'm not talking competitive dollars. I'm talking appropriated dollars. I'm talking about the formula monies. I'm talking about FNEP. Those monies that you do not have to write a proposal. You have to submit an application and document your objectives, your goals, and what your outcomes are going to be. But I'm talking about those formula dollars for the 1890, 1862s, and 1994 land grants. We're talking $381 million that come into extension. Think about Congress today. Think about the shutdown, regardless of who caused it. But just think about all of this. The bottom line was we need to reduce spending. So what does that mean for us in extension as we go forward? It means that we have to be able to talk about what's the return on this investment. What's the return on $1.14 billion or the return on $381 million? How do we sustain this investment as we go forward for the next 10 years, 20 years, or even consider the next 100 years? I say to you that there's a positive correlation between acquiring and sustaining funding and viable programs. Programs makes the difference. That's what we're about. This is my favorite P. Having been an extension agent, a district director, an administrator, and there's one thing that I always say, that what we do is not about us. We need to step back from the picture and think about who our programs are for. They are for the people. You may enjoy doing it, but if it's not making a difference, it's not having the impact that it should be having, then we shouldn't be doing it. So keep in mind, it's not about us, but it's about the people we serve, and we must show the impact of our programs on the people. If we do not make a difference, we're not going to remain in existence the next 100 years because the funding is not going to be there to support us. So I will conclude by saying we must document our efforts, communicate our outcomes, successes, and impacts if we're going to continue for the next 100 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the opportunity. I know I was between you and lunch, but it's been a good experience. Have a good conference.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay.
Lyons. We have just all token of our appreciation for you. Thank you so much for speaking to us, and good travel.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's lunchtime, everybody. Okay, you got